Dawn had not yet broken the horizon when Oberleutnant Klaus Steiner crossed the frozen hangar, his boots echoing on the oil-stained concrete. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the metallic dew of early morning filled his lungs. At 26 years old, Klaus carried in his eyes that particular weariness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from seeing too much, too soon. Outside, 23 Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 South stood in perfect formation on the tarmac, their shadows stretching like dark fingers under the floodlights. These machines were the pride of the Luftwaffe, swift, lethal, engineered to perfection. Or so everyone believed. Klaus paused beside his aircraft, tail number White 7, and ran his gloved hand along the fuselage. The metal was cold, almost alive under his touch. Inside the cockpit, a photograph was tucked into the instrument panel frame. His younger sister, Greta, standing in their family's garden in Munich, smiling at a world that no longer existed. Beautiful morning for dying, isn't it? The voice belonged to Feldwebel Otto Becker, Klaus's wingman and closest friend. Otto was shorter, stockier, with a perpetual grin that masked something deeper, something broken that he refused to acknowledge. Klaus didn't smile. Every morning is beautiful when you're not sure you'll see the next one. The briefing had been clear. Escort a formation of Junkers Ru 88 bombers to strike Allied positions near Reims. Intelligence reported minimal resistance. But Klaus had learned that minimal resistance was often code for "we have no idea what's waiting for you up there." The sky was beginning to blush pink and gold as the pilots gathered for final checks. Hauptmann Werner Vogel, their squadron leader, stood before them, a man whose face seemed carved from the same steel as the aircraft they flew. His voice cut through the morning air with military precision. "Gentlemen, this is a standard escort mission. Stay tight, stay alert, and bring everyone home. The Reich depends on us, Standard." Klaus had heard that word before every mission that turned into chaos. The formation climbed through scattered clouds, engines roaring in synchronized harmony. From his cockpit, Klaus could see the bombers ahead sluggish, vulnerable giants that depended entirely on their fighter escorts for survival. The morning sun painted everything in shades of amber and crimson, a beauty so profound it felt obscene against the purpose of their flight. His radio crackled. "White Group, this is Eagle Lead. Eyes open. Report any contacts." Klaus scanned the sky, his hand resting lightly on the control stick. The Bf 109 responded to his slightest touch, an extension of his own nervous system. He'd flown this aircraft for 8 months through storms and combat, and he knew every vibration, every quirk. But today, something felt different. It started as a subtle roughness in the engine, a slight hesitation, barely perceptible. Klaus frowned, checking his instruments. Oil pressure, normal. Temperature, normal. RPM, steady. Everything read perfectly. Yet the feeling persisted. "Contact. Spitfires, 11 o'clock high." The radio exploded with voices. Klaus's heart lurched as he spotted them 12 British fighters diving from the sun, exactly where they'd been waiting. Not minimal resistance. An ambush. "Break right." "Break right." Werner's voice, urgent now. The formation scattered like startled birds. Klaus hauled his stick, the G-forces crushing him into his seat as White 7 rolled into a hard turn. An enemy aircraft flashed past his canopy, so close he could see the pilot's face. The sky became a swirling chaos of aircraft, tracer rounds arcing through the air like deadly fireworks. Klaus's training took over muscle memory, replacing conscious thought. He pulled behind a Spitfire, lined up his gun sight, squeezed the trigger. His cannons hammered, the recoil shuddering through the airframe. The British fighter broke away trailing smoke, but Klaus didn't follow. Never chase a crippled enemy. "That's how you die." "Otto, where are you?" Klaus called into his radio. Static. Otto. More static, then finally. I'm here. On your 6 no. Wait, where did you? The transmission cut off. Klaus's blood turned to ice. He craned his neck, searching frantically. They're Otto's aircraft, spinning wildly, its engine sputtering. Not hit, not burning, just failing. Then Klaus felt it again. That roughness. Stronger now. His engine coughed, missed a beat, coughed again. The temperature gauge suddenly spiked into the red zone. Impossible. Everything had checked out on the ground. White 7, you're trailing smoke. Another pilot's voice, panicked. Klaus looked back. A thin gray plume streamed from his cowling. His engine temperature was climbing dangerously 110 degrees. 115, 120. He pulled back the throttle, trying to cool it, but the damage was done. Around him, the battle continued, but Klaus could barely focus. 3 other Bf-109s were breaking formation, all showing signs of engine failure. Not from enemy fire, just failing. Werner's voice came through, strained. All aircraft disengage. Return to base. Something's wrong. Klaus pointed his nose toward home, nursing his dying engine. The Messerschmitt was losing altitude steadily 1,000 feet per minute. He adjusted his mixture, his prop pitch, everything he could think of, but the temperature wouldn't drop. At 8,000 feet, the engine ceased completely. The sudden silence was deafening. No roar, no vibration, just the whistle of wind over the wings and the hammering of his own heartbeat. Klaus went through the emergency procedures mechanically. Airspeed 180 kilometers per hour. Trim for glide, look for a field. Below him, the French countryside spread out in a patchwork of farms and forests. Beautiful, indifferent. He spotted a meadow barely long enough, but it would have to do. No time for doubt. No time for fear. The ground rushed up. Klaus pulled back gently, feeling for the stall, letting the aircraft settle. The wheels touched grass, bounced, touched again. The tail came down. He was rolling, slowing, and then he stopped. Klaus sat in the silence, hands trembling on the stick, breathing hard. Alive, impossibly, miraculously alive. Through his canopy, he watched 3 parachutes descending in the distance. His squadron mates also forced down. And somewhere among them, he prayed, was Otto. He climbed out onto the wing, legs shaky, and looked at his aircraft. White 7 sat in the field like a wounded bird, smoke still rising from the engine cowling. There was no visible damage from combat. No holes. No burns from enemy fire. Just a catastrophic failure that made no sense. As Klaus stood there in the morning sunlight, the sound of approaching engines made him turn. Not aircraft vehicles. German recovery trucks already dispatched to collect the fallen fighters. But as the first truck arrived and the mechanics began examining his engine, Klaus saw something in their faces. Recognition, horror, and something worse, confirmation. The head mechanic, an older man with grease-stained hands, pulled Klaus aside. Oberleutnant, how many hours on this engine? 47 since the last overhaul. Why? The mechanic's expression darkened. Because this is the 6th engine failure this week. All of them with similar hours. All of them. The same flaw. Klaus felt his stomach drop. What kind of flaw? The mechanic hesitated, then spoke quietly. The kind someone should have caught months ago. The kind that's going to ground the entire fighter wing. He opened the cowling, revealing the engine's internal mechanism. There, visible even to Klaus's untrained eye, was the problem. A series of hairline cracks in the supercharger mounting caused by a metallurgical defect in the casting process. Invisible during standard inspections. Fatal under sustained combat stress. How many aircraft are affected? Klaus asked, though he already feared the answer. Every Bf-109 G6 built in the last 4 months. Possibly hundreds across all fronts. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. At that moment, Klaus understood. This wasn't about one aircraft or one squadron. This was about a systemic flaw and overlooked weakness in the very machines upon which the Luftwaffe's air superiority depended. And it had chosen the worst possible moment to reveal itself, just as the Allies were growing stronger, bolder, more numerous. In the distance, another Messerschmitt limped overhead, trailing smoke, desperately seeking a place to land. Klaus looked up at the sky, that beautiful, merciless sky, and realized that the war had just changed in ways that no one could have predicted. Not through heroism or cowardice, not through strategy or sacrifice, but through a single invisible flaw that no one had seen coming. The hangar had become a morgue for machines. 27 Messerschmitt fighters sat in rows, their engines exposed like open chests during surgery. Mechanics moved between them with the grim efficiency of doctors triaging the wounded, their tools scraping and clanking in the cavernous space. But unlike patients, these aircraft would not heal with time. Klaus stood at the entrance, watching the scene with hollow eyes. He hadn't slept since the emergency landing. None of them had. The entire squadron had been grounded not by enemy action, but by an invisible enemy they couldn't fight with guns or courage. Oberleutnant Steiner. Klaus turned to find Oberst Heinrich Adler, the base commander, approaching with purposeful strides. Adler was a veteran of the First War, a man whose medal spoke of another era, another kind of combat. His face was weathered, carved by decades of military service, but his eyes held something Klaus had rarely seen, genuine concern. "Walk with me," Adler said. It wasn't a request. They left the hangar, stepping into the afternoon sunlight. The airfield stretched before them, empty flight lines where dozens of fighters should have been preparing for missions. The silence was unnatural, oppressive. "How many did we lose yesterday?" Klaus asked quietly. 6 aircraft forced down. 17 more showing signs of the same defect. "And that's just our base." Adler paused, choosing his words carefully. "Command is receiving similar reports from every fighter wing equipped with the G6 variant. France, Italy, even the Eastern Front." Klaus felt the weight of those words settle over him like a physical burden. How is this possible? Don't we test these engines? We do, extensively. Adler's voice carried frustration and something deeper, betrayal. But this particular flaw, it only manifests under specific conditions. High altitude, sustained combat stress, temperature variations. The supercharger mountings were cast using a new alloy, supposedly stronger, lighter. Someone in the supply chain cut corners. Used substandard materials. And no one caught it until now. They reached the edge of the airfield where a group of pilots sat in the grass, smoking, staring at the empty sky. Klaus recognized Otto among them, his usual grin replaced by a blank expression. He'd made it back yesterday, barely, his parachute landing him in a farmer's field 3 kilometers from the base. "What happens now?" Klaus asked. Adler stopped, turning to face him directly. "Now? We ground every G6 until we can inspect and replace the defective components. That's 600 aircraft across all fronts. 600 fighters that won't be flying escort missions, won't be intercepting bomber formations, won't be defending our positions. For how long? Weeks, maybe months?" Adler's jaw tightened. "The Allies won't wait for us to fix our mistakes, Steiner. They're planning something big. We've intercepted enough communications to know that. And when they come, we'll be watching from the ground." Klaus looked back at the hangar, at the disabled machines that represented months of engineering, millions of Reichsmarks, and the collective skill of Germany's finest pilots, all rendered useless by a flaw measured in millimeters. There has to be something we can do, Klaus said, though even as he spoke, he knew how hollow it sounded. Adler's expression softened slightly. There is. We adapt. We survive. We find another way. He placed a hand on Klaus's shoulder. You're a good pilot, Steiner. One of the best I've seen. But this war isn't going to be won or lost in the cockpit anymore. It's going to be decided in factories, in supply lines, in the thousand small decisions that no one sees until it's too late. Klaus sat alone in his room, a small space barely large enough for a bed, desk, and footlocker. A single lamp cast long shadows on the wall where he'd pinned photographs his family, his squadron mates, places he'd flown over and somehow survived. The letter in his hands trembled slightly. It had arrived that afternoon, forwarded through military postal channels from Munich. His sister's handwriting careful, practiced, the script she'd learned in school before the world changed. Dear Klaus, I hope this letter finds you safe. Mother worries constantly, though she tries not to show it. Father doesn't speak much about the war anymore, but I see it in his eyes every time the radio announces new developments. The city has changed so much since you left. There are fewer people on the streets, more empty shops. Everyone is tired, Klaus, so very tired, but we endure. We have to believe that what you're doing up there matters, that the sacrifices mean something. Please come home soon. Please be careful. Your sister, Greta Klaus, folded the letter carefully, returning it to its envelope. The words, "Please be careful," echoed in his mind. How could he explain that being careful wasn't enough anymore? That the greatest danger wasn't enemy fighters or flak, but the invisible weaknesses in the very machines they trusted with their lives. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, Otto entered, carrying 2 bottles of beer liberated from somewhere in the base's supply system. He handed one to Klaus without a word and sat on the edge of the bed. Can't sleep either? Otto asked. Too quiet. I'm used to the sound of engines. They drank in silence for a moment. Outside, the night was still except for the occasional footsteps of sentries making their rounds. I've been thinking, Otto said finally, his voice uncharacteristically serious. About yesterday. About how close we came. We've come close before. Not like this. Otto stared at his bottle. When the engine quit, when I was falling. It wasn't fear I felt. It was anger. Not at the British, not at the war. At us. At the fact that we put so much faith in these machines, and they betrayed us. Klaus understood. The bond between pilot and aircraft was almost spiritual, a trust built through countless hours in the air, through storms and combat and the razor's edge between life and death. To have that trust broken not by enemy action but by negligence felt like a personal violation. My father was a craftsman, Otto continued, a clockmaker. He used to say that precision matters because lives depend on it. A clock might just tell time, but a flaw in its mechanism means someone misses a train, an appointment, a moment that can't be recovered. He looked up at Klaus. What happens when the flaw is in something that's supposed to keep you alive? Before Klaus could answer, footsteps echoed in the hallway, rapid, urgent. The door burst open without ceremony. All officers to the briefing room. Now. It was Lieutenant Maximilian Wolf, the squadron's operations officer, his face flushed from running. What's happening? Klaus asked, already standing. They're sending us up. Otto's eyes widened. But the aircraft, not all of them are grounded. Command has cleared 15 fighters that passed emergency inspections. There's a massive Allied bomber formation heading toward the Ruhr. Every available aircraft is being scrambled. Klaus felt his pulse quicken. When? Dawn. 6 hours from now. The room was packed with pilots from 3 different squadrons, all drawn from the handful of serviceable aircraft remaining across multiple bases. Klaus recognized faces he'd only seen in passing men from other units, other fights, all thrown together by necessity. Oberst Adler stood before a large map of northern France and western Germany, marked with red arrows indicating the expected bomber route. His face was grave. "Gentlemen, at approximately 5:30, British and American bombers will cross the Channel in strength. Intelligence estimates between 300 and 400 aircraft flying Fortresses, Liberators, Lancasters escorted by fighters. Their target is the industrial complex in Essen." The room erupted in murmurs. 400 bombers. It was a nightmare scenario even with a full fighter wing. With only 15 serviceable aircraft. "I won't pretend this will be easy," Adler continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "You'll be outnumbered at least 20 to 1. But you're all that stands between those bombers and our factories. Our people." Klaus glanced around the room. Faces showed varying degrees of emotion, determination, fear, resignation, anger. These were men who'd faced death countless times, but always with the confidence that their machines would respond, would carry them through. That confidence had been shattered. "Your aircraft have been triple-checked," Adler said, as if reading their thoughts. "The mechanics have worked through the night. These fighters are sound." But Klaus heard the uncertainty beneath the words. How could anyone be certain anymore? The briefing continued with tactical details, altitudes, formations, radio frequencies, but Klaus barely absorbed it. His mind was already in the cockpit, already climbing toward an impossible fight. When dismissed, the pilots filed out silently. Klaus found himself walking beside Hauptmann Erich Lehmann, a veteran with 12 confirmed victories and a reputation for calm under pressure. "What do you think our chances are?" Klaus asked quietly. Lehmann's expression was unreadable. "We'll do what we've always done. Fly until we can't. Fight until it's finished." He paused. "But Steiner, remember, courage doesn't mean not being afraid. It means flying anyway." The eastern sky was beginning to lighten as Klaus approached his aircraft. Not White 7, that fighter was still under repair. This was White 11, an older model but reportedly sound. The mechanics had painted a fresh kill marking on the fuselage overnight, a gesture of optimism that felt almost defiant. Klaus performed his preflight check with meticulous care, examining every panel, every connection, every gauge. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind churned with doubt. How many other pilots had done the same yesterday? How many had trusted their inspections, only to fall from the sky? The other pilots were climbing into their cockpits, engines coughing to life one by one. The familiar roar should have been reassuring, but instead, Klaus heard only the potential for failure in each mechanical note. He pulled himself up onto the wing, settled into the seat, and began the startup sequence. The Daimler-Benz engine caught on the second try, settling into a steady rhythm, temperature normal, pressure normal, everything reading perfectly, just like yesterday. Klaus's radio crackled. "All aircraft, this is Eagle Lead. Final checks. Report status. One by one, the pilots confirmed their readiness. 15 voices. 15 men about to fly into impossible odds with machines they could no longer fully trust. Eagle Lead to all aircraft. We have confirmation. Bombers approaching coast. Time to intercept. 40 minutes. Form up on my wing. And gentlemen, ... double quotes a pause. Good hunting." Klaus released the brakes and taxied into position. The dawn sky ahead was painted in shades of crimson and gold, beautiful, indifferent, eternal. As he advanced the throttle and felt the fighter surge forward, Klaus thought of his sister's letter, of her plea to be careful. He thought of Otto's words about precision and trust. He thought of the thousands of workers in Essen who had no idea that their defense rested on 15 patched-together fighters flown by exhausted men. The wheels left the ground. Klaus retracted the landing gear and began his climb. watching his instruments with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every fluctuation, every needle movement could be a warning or nothing at all. Below, the French countryside receded. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, 400 enemy bombers were coming. And somewhere in the machinery around him, a Flaw might be waiting. The sky at this altitude was a cathedral of light and shadow. Klaus's formation climbed through scattered clouds, 15 silver specks against an infinite canvas of blue. Below, the patchwork of fields and villages looked peaceful, almost unreal, as if the war existed only in this upper realm where men fought among the clouds. His radio remained mostly silent. Each pilot was alone with his thoughts, his fears, his instruments. Klaus's eyes moved constantly between the horizon and his gauges. Oil pressure, steady. Temperature, normal. Engine RPM, holding at 2,400. Every reading was perfect. But yesterday, they had been perfect too. Eagle lead to all aircraft. Enemy formation at 12 o'clock 20 miles. Maintain altitude and prepare for engagement. Klaus's pulse quickened. He strained his eyes forward, searching the sky. At first, nothing, just endless blue and the morning sun climbing from the east. Then he saw them. A dark mass on the horizon, like a swarm of insects. But these were no insects. They were Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress's massive four-engine bombers, bristling with defensive weapons, flying in tight formation for mutual protection. And there were so many of them. The intelligence reports hadn't exaggerated. Mother of God, Otto's voice crackled over the radio, barely a whisper. Klaus understood the sentiment. He'd intercepted bomber formations before, but never anything like this. The American formation stretched for miles, wave after wave of heavy bombers, their aluminum skin glinting in the sunlight like a river of steel flowing toward Germany. And above them, weaving back and forth like protective sharks, were their escorts, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, dozens of them, ready to pounce on any threat to their charges. 15 German fighters against this armada. Eagle lead to all aircraft. We focus on the bombers. Hit them hard, break their formation, force them to scatter. Ignore the escorts unless engaged. Understood? A chorus of acknowledgments crackled through Klaus's headset. Then let's remind them who owns this sky. Eagle led attacking. Follow me down. Hauptmann Lemin's fighter rolled into a steep dive, and Klaus followed, his hand instinctively tightening on the control stick. The Messerschmitt accelerated rapidly, the wind screaming over the canopy as they plunged toward the bomber formation. Klaus's world narrowed to essentials. Airspeed increasing 400, 450, 500 kilometers per hour. Target ahead the lead bomber in the first box formation. Distance closing 2,000 meters, 1,500, 1,000. The bombers grew from dots to recognizable shapes to massive machines, their turrets already tracking the diving fighters. Klaus could see the waist gunners scrambling to their positions, could imagine the fear in the crew as they watched the German fighters hurtle toward them. At 600 meters, Klaus squeezed the trigger. His 20mm cannons hammered, the recoil shuddering through the entire airframe. Tracer rounds lanced through the air, converging on the bomber's fuselage. Hits sparked along the wing, the engine cowling. Pieces of metal spun away into the slipstream. Then Klaus was through, diving beneath the formation, pulling up hard to avoid collision. The G-forces crushed him into his seat. 3 Gs, 4, 5, his vision tunneling as blood drained from his head. He leveled out 2,000 feet below the bombers, gasping for breath, checking his mirrors. Behind him, the formation had been disrupted. 2 bombers were trailing smoke, one visibly losing altitude. But the rest pressed on, undeterred, their bomb bays still closed as they headed toward their target. Bandits, Escorts coming down. Klaus looked up and saw them American fighters peeling off their protective pattern, diving toward the German formation with murderous intent. The numerical advantage was devastating. For every German fighter, there were at least 5 escorts. "Break left! Break left!" Someone screamed over the radio. The sky erupted into chaos. Klaus hauled his stick hard, the Messerschmitt responding instantly. A P-47 flashed past his nose, so close he could see the pilot's oxygen mask. He rolled inverted, pulled through, came out heading the opposite direction. His mind worked on pure instinct, now no time for conscious thought, only reaction and survival. An American fighter appeared in his gun sight. Klaus fired a quick burst, too hasty, too desperate. The tracers fell behind the target. The Thunderbolt rolled away and was gone, swallowed by the swirling mass of aircraft. Klaus's breathing was ragged inside his oxygen mask. Sweat stung his eyes. The adrenaline made his hands shake on the controls. Around him, the radio was a cacophony of voices, warnings, curses, desperate calls for help. Then he felt it. A slight vibration. A hesitation in the engine's rhythm. No. Klaus's eyes snapped to his instruments. Temperature rising not quickly, but steadily. Oil pressure fluctuating. The tachometer needle wavering just slightly. Not now. Please, not now. He eased back on the throttle, trying to reduce stress on the engine. But in combat, reducing power meant becoming vulnerable, meant becoming prey. "White 11, you're trailing vapor." Otto's voice, urgent with concern. Klaus twisted in his seat, looking back. A thin white stream followed his aircraft coolant leaking from somewhere in the engine compartment. The temperature gauge continued climbing. 95 degrees, 100, 105. The flaw. The same invisible weakness that had grounded his squadron. It had found him here now, 23,000 feet above enemy territory with hostile fighters swarming like angry hornets. "I'm hit," Klaus transmitted, though he knew it wasn't enemy fire. "Engine overheating. Breaking off. Copy, White 11. Head for home. We'll cover you." But there was no covering anyone in this chaos. Each pilot was fighting his own desperate battle for survival. Klaus pointed his nose down and west, toward France, toward the base, toward any hope of reaching friendly territory before the engine seized completely. He throttled back further, sacrificing speed for temperature control. The gauge stopped climbing, stuck at 115 degrees, right at the edge of critical failure. Behind him, the battle continued. He could hear it on the radio snatches of frantic communication, the chatter of men fighting for their lives. A scream, cut short. Silence from one call sign, then another. Klaus forced himself to focus on his own crisis. Altitude, 18,000 feet and descending. Airspeed, 320 kilometers per hour and falling. Distance to friendly lines, approximately 80 kilometers. The mathematics of survival played out in his mind. At his current descent rate, he'd reach 10,000 feet before crossing the front lines. Low enough for ground fire. Low enough to be vulnerable to any prowling enemy fighter looking for easy prey. The engine coughed once, twice. "Come on," Klaus whispered to his machine, as if words could hold metal together. Just a little further. The temperature gauge crept higher. 118 degrees. The vibration was becoming more pronounced, a rhythmic shudder that ran through the entire airframe. Klaus could smell it now, the acrid scent of overheating metal, of lubricating oil breaking down under extreme heat. At 15,000 feet, he saw the front lines below, a scarred ribbon of earth separating the occupied territories from the Allied positions. Smoke from artillery fire drifted across the landscape. Tiny figures moved in trenches like ants in a disturbed nest, almost there. Then the engine made a sound Klaus would never forget, a grinding, tearing shriek of metal consuming itself. The propeller windmilled freely for one revolution, too, then seized with a violent jerk that snapped Klaus forward against his harness. Silence. The sudden absence of engine noise was surreal, dreamlike. Only the whistle of wind remained and the hammering of his own heart. Klaus was now a glider pilot, commanding a 30-ton machine never designed for unpowered flight. He had altitude 12,000 feet and forward momentum. That was all. Mayday, mayday. White 11 going down. Engine failure at 12,000 coordinates. White 11, this is Eagle Lead. Copy your position. Do you have controllability? Affirmative. But I'm not making it back to base. Understood. Look for any flat ground. Fields, roads. Get down in one piece. That's an order. Klaus almost smiled at that, as if survival were simply a matter of following orders. He scanned the ground below, searching for possibilities. The landscape was a mix of forests, villages, and farmland, none of it ideal for an emergency landing. But there a long, straight section of road, probably part of the old Roman network that crisscrossed this region, it would have to do. Klaus set up his approach with the precision drilled into him through hundreds of hours of training. Airspeed, 200 kilometers per hour. Nose slightly down to maintain speed. Wings level. Watch for obstacles, power lines, trees, vehicles. The ground rushed up faster than it should have. Without engine power, he had no ability to add speed or climb if something went wrong. This was a one-way commitment, no second chances. At 500 feet, he committed to the road. At 300 feet, he could see individual stones in the pavement. At 100 feet, he noticed a farmer standing in a field, staring up at the descending fighter with an expression Klaus couldn't read: fear, curiosity, perhaps pity. The wheels touched asphalt with a screech. The Messerschmitt bounced once, hard, then settled. Klaus stood on the brakes, feeling them grab, feeling the fighter decelerate. But the road was ending. He could see a stone bridge ahead, too narrow, too solid. He released the brakes and hauled the stick into his lap, deliberately ground looping the aircraft. The fighter spun sideways, the tail whipping around. Metal scraped against stone. The canopy cracked. The world became a blur of motion and noise. Then stillness. Klaus sat in the canted cockpit, breathing hard, tasting blood where he'd bitten his tongue. His hands were still locked on the control stick. Slowly, deliberately, he forced himself to let go. He was alive. The realization hit him with almost physical force. Alive when every probability said he should be dead or captured or burning in a wreck. Klaus popped the canopy and climbed out onto the wing. The Messerschmitt lay at an angle across the road. One wing crumpled. The landing gear collapsed. But the cockpit was intact. The fuel tanks hadn't ruptured. Alive. He jumped down to the ground and staggered a few steps before his legs gave out. He sat on the road, his back against the stone wall of the bridge, and looked at his aircraft. White 11. A machine that had carried him through combat, that had almost gotten him home, betrayed not by enemy action but by a flaw no one had caught, no one had predicted. In the distance, Klaus could hear engines, German recovery vehicles, probably, racing to retrieve both pilot and aircraft before Allied forces could arrive. He looked up at the sky where the battle had been fought. Contrails still streaked the blue, but the formations had moved on. How many of his squadron mates had made it through? How many had fallen to American guns? How many had suffered the same engine failure, but without his luck? The sound of engines grew louder. Klaus didn't move. He simply sat there, letting the adrenaline drain from his system, letting the reality sink in. They were grounding the fighters, hundreds of them, and even those cleared to fly couldn't be trusted. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of German air power. The sword that had swept across Europe was being brought down not by superior enemy skill, but by an invisible weakness in its own machinery. And Klaus knew, with absolute certainty, that this was only the beginning. 3 days had passed since the mission. Klaus stood in the hangar, watching mechanics disassemble the engine from White 11. The aircraft had been recovered from the road where he'd crash-landed, towed back to base on a flatbed truck like a wounded animal returning to die at home. The supercharger assembly lay on a workbench, split open for examination. Even from a distance, Klaus could see the hairline fractures spiderwebbing through the metal cracks, so fine they were almost invisible, yet deadly enough to bring down a fighter in combat. Oberst Adler approached from behind, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. 7 aircraft, Adler said quietly. That's how many we lost in that mission. 3 to enemy fire, 4 to engine failure. Klaus didn't turn around. His eyes remained fixed on the broken machinery. And the bombers? Made it to their target. Essen took significant damage. Industrial output will be reduced for weeks, maybe months. The silence between them carried the weight of unspoken truths. 15 fighters had been thrown against impossible odds, and they'd failed. Not because the pilots lacked courage or skill, but because the machines they depended on had betrayed them at the critical moment. Command has made a decision, Adler continued. All Bf 109 G6 variants are officially grounded across all theaters. Immediate inspection and replacement of every affected component. It's going to take at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Klaus finally turned to face him. What do we fly in the meantime? Older models. F variants, some early G models. Whatever we can scrounge from reserves and training units. Adler's expression was grim. We're cannibalizing our own force just to keep minimal air defense operational, Klaus thought of the bomber formations he'd seen hundreds of aircraft flying in broad daylight with near impunity, protected by swarms of escorts. And now the Luftwaffe would face them with outdated fighters and exhausted pilots. We're losing, aren't we? Klaus said it not as a question but as a statement of fact. Adler was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weariness of a man who'd seen too many wars, too many defeats disguised as tactical necessities. We lost the moment we stopped paying attention to the details. War isn't won by grand strategies alone, Steiner. It's won by 10,000 small decisions, each rivet placed correctly, each inspection performed thoroughly, each warning sign heeded before it becomes catastrophic. He gestured toward the broken engine. That flaw existed for months. Hundreds of engines were built and installed before anyone noticed. And now we're paying the price. Klaus walked to the workbench and picked up a piece of the fractured supercharger mount. The metal felt cold, lifeless in his hand. My father always told me that machines don't lie, Klaus said softly. They show you exactly what you put into them. Cut corners and they'll fail when you need them most. Your father was a wise man. He was a factory foreman. Before the war, he inspected every component that came through his production line. Klaus set the piece down carefully. He would have caught this. He would have seen it and stopped it before a single defective part reached an aircraft. Adler nodded slowly. Then we need more men like your father. And fewer men willing to ignore problems for the sake of meeting quotas. Klaus sat at his small desk, pen in hand, staring at blank paper. He'd been trying to write to his sister for over an hour, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what had happened? How could he tell her that the machines they'd trusted, the technology they'd believed gave them an advantage, had turned out to be fundamentally flawed? Finally, he began to write, Dear Greta, I'm safe. I wanted you to know that first, before anything else. Something happened recently that has made me think about Father's work at the factory. Do you remember how he used to come home and talk about precision? About how every measurement mattered, Every inspection was critical? I understand now what he meant. I understand that wars aren't just fought with courage and sacrifice. They're fought with attention to detail, with craftsmanship, with the integrity of people who do their jobs correctly even when no one is watching. We've learned a difficult lesson here. We've learned that overlooking small flaws, things measured in millimeters, can cost lives, missions perhaps, even the outcome of everything we're fighting for. I don't know what comes next, but I know that when I return home, and I will return, I want to help build things that last, things made with care and precision. Not weapons of war, but things that bring people together. Tell mother and father I love them. Tell them their son is learning the lessons they tried to teach him, even if it took a war to make him listen. Your brother, Klaus, he folded the letter carefully, sealed it in an envelope, and set it aside for the next postal collection. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Otto entered without waiting for permission, his face bearing news. They're posting the new assignments, Otto said. We're being transferred. Where? Training Command, Munich. Klaus felt something twist in his chest, relief mixed with shame. Munich meant going home, seeing his family, stepping back from the front lines. But it also meant acknowledging that the air war had moved beyond them, that younger pilots would have to face what they could not. When? Klaus asked. Week after next. They want experienced pilots training the new recruits. Teaching them how to survive what we barely survived ourselves? Klaus nodded slowly. Training. Passing on lessons learned at terrible cost. It wasn't the glorious continuation of combat they'd imagined, but perhaps it was more important. Otto, Klaus said quietly, do you ever wonder if we'll win this war? Otto sat on the edge of the bed, his usual grin absent. I stopped wondering about winning. Now I just think about surviving. About making sure the mistakes we made don't kill the next generation of pilots. That's probably the most honest thing you've ever said to me. War has a way of making you honest. Otto stood. Come on. They're gathering everyone in the mess hall. Oberst Adler wants to address the squadron one last time before the transfers begin. The room was packed with pilots, mechanics, ground crew, everyone who'd been part of the squadron's daily operations. Faces Klaus had seen every morning, voices he'd heard over the radio during combat, hands that had patched his aircraft after each mission. Oberst Adler stood before them, his uniform pressed, his medals catching the light. But his expression was softer than Klaus had ever seen it. I won't waste time with speeches about glory or destiny, Adler began. You've all heard enough of those. What I will tell you is this. You've done everything asked of you and more. You've flown outdated aircraft against superior numbers. You've faced odds that should have been impossible. And you've done it with skill and courage that any commander would be proud of. He paused, letting his words settle. But courage alone doesn't win wars. We've learned that the hard way. The engine failures, the grounded aircraft, the missions we couldn't fly, these weren't failures of will or bravery. They were failures of system, of oversight, of the thousand small decisions that happen far from the cockpit. Klaus felt the truth of those words resonate through the room. Many of you are being reassigned, Adler continued. Some to training commands, others to new units, some to different roles entirely. And I want you to carry this lesson with you. Pay attention to the details. Question the systems. Don't accept good enough when lives depend on perfection. Because the next generation of pilots will depend on what you teach them, how you prepare them, what standards you hold them to. He looked around the room, making eye contact with individual pilots. The war will go on. Battles will be won and lost. But the real victory, the lasting one, comes from learning from our mistakes, from building better systems, from ensuring that the sacrifices we've made mean something. Adler straightened. You've been a privilege to command. Each and every one of you. Dismissed. The room remained silent for a moment, then slowly began to empty. Pilots shook hands, embraced, made promises to stay in touch that might or might not be kept. The bonds forged in combat were being stretched across new assignments, new realities. Klaus found himself standing with Otto, both watching the dispersal of their squadron. "Strange, isn't it?" Otto said. "We survived everything the enemy could throw at us, only to be brought down by a flaw we couldn't even see." "Maybe that's the point," Klaus replied. "The most dangerous threats are often the ones we don't see coming. The ones we assume are fine because they passed inspection, because someone else checked them, because they worked yesterday." Philosophical Steiner. "The war really has changed you," Klaus smiled slightly. "Or maybe it just gave me time to think." The morning was cool and misty as Klaus stood on the platform, waiting for the train that would carry him to Munich. His belongings were packed in a single duffel bag, everything he owned in the world reduced to clothes, photographs, and memories. Otto stood beside him, smoking a cigarette, both of them watching the tracks stretch into the fog. "You think they'll fix it?" Otto asked. "All those aircraft, all those engines?" "They'll fix the immediate problem," Klaus said. "Replace the defective parts, implement new inspection protocols. But the real question is whether they'll fix the system that allowed the flaw to exist in the first place." The distant whistle of an approaching train echoed through the morning air. "I hope you're right," Otto said. "I hope someone learns from this." The train emerged from the mist, slowing as it approached the platform. Steam hissed from its brakes. Doors opened and passengers began to disembark, soldiers on leave, civilians traveling on business, all moving through a world transformed by war. Klaus picked up his bag and turned to Otto. They didn't embrace, that wasn't the way of military men in public. But the handshake they shared carried years of shared danger, trust earned in the crucible of combat. "Stay safe, Otto." "You too, Klaus, and when this is all over, we'll drink beer in Munich and laugh about how we survived. I'll hold you to that." Klaus boarded the train and found a seat by the window. As the train began to move, he watched the airfield recede, the hangars where broken aircraft waited for repair, the flight line where fighters should have been preparing for missions, the empty sky that told its own story. He thought about the lessons written in steel and blood, about the invisible flaws that could bring down even the mightiest machines, about the importance of precision, oversight, and the courage to acknowledge mistakes before they became catastrophic. The war would continue. Other battles would be fought, other missions flown. But somewhere in the factories, in the design bureaus, in the quiet offices where decisions were made, Klaus hoped that someone was learning, that the sacrifice of grounded squadrons and lost pilots would translate into better systems, more thorough inspections, a commitment to excellence that went beyond meeting production quotas. As the French countryside rolled past his window, Klaus pulled out his sister's photograph, Greta smiling in a garden that existed before the world changed. He'd be home soon. He'd teach new pilots the lessons he'd learned. And perhaps, in some small way, he'd help ensure that the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated in the future. The train carried him west, toward home, toward whatever came next. Behind him, the broken fighters remained grounded, silent testimony to a truth every engineer and pilot eventually learns, that the difference between success and catastrophe often measures no thicker than a hairline crack in metal, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in the sky, but in the attention to detail that keeps aircraft aloft and pilots alive.